This is the story of an island so remote, no human had stepped foot on it until the end of the 18th century. And it's the story of how a boat built on the other side of the world would devastate the biological diversity on that island. The year was 1907, and the Clyde Shipbuilding Company had just completed building a new steamship at its yard in Port Glasgow, Scotland. She measured just over 210 feet and was designed to carry cargo and passengers across open stretches of ocean. The ship was purchased by Burns Phillip & Co. Limited and set sail for her new home in eastern Australia. She was named the SS Macambo after a tiny island in the Solomon Islands, and her route primarily consisted of travel between Australia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the New Hebrides. By 1910, her primary route was from Sydney to Lord Howe Island, then on to Norfolk Island, and finally up to the Solomon Islands. Then the ship would turn around and travel back. The SS Macambo completed this route for 8 years, nearly without incident. But that all changed in 1918. Just as the First World War was ending, a biological war on this tiny island was about to start. Welcome back to All.About.Nature. On my channel, I try to bring nature-related content that's entertaining and educational. If you like this kind of content, then please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, or even subscribing to the channel. I would also like to quickly thank my patrons. Thank you all for supporting the channel. If you would like to become a patron, follow the link in the video description below. I really appreciate your support. Lord Howe Island is an incredibly unique place. Like any other remote island, it was difficult for species of plant and animal to colonize it, but once they did, they developed into totally unique species. Island habitats are almost always home to high numbers of endemic species. But because they have a limited range and often occur nowhere else in the world, species in these habitats are also highly susceptible to mass extinction should anything change the delicate balance of the ecosystem. Lord Howe Island is only 14.5 square kilometers. It's semi-tropical and covered in broadleaf forests. The beaches are beautiful, and the surrounding waters are teeming with life in its coral reefs. The island is a crescent shape, and on the southern end of the island are some high mountains, with the highest peak being Mount Gower, which stands 875 meters tall. Around the main island are 27 other islands, islets, and rocks, which make up the Lord Howe Island group. Before the 18th century, no human had ever inhabited the island. In 1788, the first record of the island was made. A passing British ship claimed it for Britain and collected sea turtles and birds to take back to Sydney. Upon hearing about the abundant fish around the island and many turtles on the beaches, and the birds that were so tame one could catch them by hand, the island became a popular spot for whalers to stop by on their long voyages. It only took a few years for some endemic species to go extinct. First was the Lord Howe swamp hen. This species could be blue, white, or some combination of the two, and was closely related to the Australasian swamp hen. It had a red bill and legs, and it was abundant on the island. Sailors could kill them easily with a stick as they passed by because they had no fear of humans. The last mention of the species is from 1790, only 2 years after the island was discovered. While it likely persisted a while longer, it was certainly entirely gone by the 1830s, having been hunted to extinction. Thankfully, 2 specimens were collected from the island and exist in museums today, allowing modern research to take place. Next to go was the Lord Howe pigeon. The first people to land on the island collected over 70 of these pigeons to eat over the course of their short stay. They were easily caught by hand, and horrifically, the captain of the ship, Thomas Gilbert, wrote that he collected them by catching one, breaking its legs, and leaving it to call out in pain. This drew in more pigeons, which were curious about the suffering of their comrade, and they too were caught and killed. 2 years later, a sailor passing through painted the species and produced the only image we have of the bird today. In 1853, the last pigeon was hunted, and just like that, the species was gone. The British established a permanent settlement on Lord Howe Island in 1834, and the population remained tiny, numbering less than 50 people for the rest of the century. Settlers brought crops and livestock to the island, and several local species, such as the Lord Howe red onion, began to be cultivated. Beginning in the 1850s, scientists arrived on the island to record local flora and fauna. A botanical garden was established, and scientists had a growing interest in the unique species that called the island home. 202 bird species have been recorded on the island, with 14 of them being endemic. Only 2 mammals, the large forest bat and the endemic Lord Howe long-eared bat, could be found when people arrived. 1 species of skink and 1 species of gecko both lived only on Lord Howe. And many species of invertebrate could be found, including snails, cockroaches, the Lord Howe stag beetle, and most famously, the Lord Howe Island stick insect. 459 species of plant have been catalogued on Lord Howe Island, 44% of which are endemic, being found nowhere else on Earth. 4 species of palm tree have also been documented, and one of them proved to be particularly important. As the whaling industry died down, the residents of Lord Howe needed to find a new way to make an income. Thankfully, around this time began the European obsession with exotic plant collecting for greenhouses, hotel lobbies, and private homes. Palms were particularly fashionable, and one species from Lord Howe Island, the Kentia palm, was especially popular because it could grow in low light, low humidity, and cooler temperatures. By the 1880s, the Kentia palm industry was established, and the island was protected as a forest reserve. In 1906, the Lord Howe Island Kentia Palm Nursery was formed, and the industry took off. 4 years later, the SS Macombo visited Lord Howe Island for the first time, and she continued to do so on a regular basis for the next 8 years. But in 1918, a seemingly small event changed the natural history of Lord Howe Island forever. On the 15th of June, 1918, the SS Macombo was approaching Lord Howe Island when it hit a submerged rock off the north coast near Ned's Beach. Fearing that the ship would sink, the passengers had to immediately disembark. Small boats were used to carry the passengers to shore, but one of these boats capsized, and a single passenger, Miss Reedon, ended up drowning. While this was, of course, tragic, something even more tragic was about to take place. The crew desperately wanted to lower the weight of the ship. Their solution was to grab the cargo and throw it overboard. On this particular journey, the cargo was primarily bananas. So, carts of fruit were tossed into the ocean, eventually washing up on the shore. But the carts didn't just carry fruit. They carried a common stowaway on ships: black rats. And with their introduction to the unsuspecting island, the fate of its many endemic species was sealed. Within 9 days, the SS Macombo was repaired and on her way to Australia. But the rats were there to stay, and they began to breed, quickly. Residents weren't able to avoid the new pests. One of the main problems they were having was with their Kentia palm plantation. The rats were eating all the seeds that the islanders normally sold, devastating the island's economy. So, only 4 years after the rats' arrival, the residents thought of a plan to wipe them out. What they needed, they thought, was a new predator that would focus its energy on the rats and take care of them all. Between 1922 and 1930, Tasmanian masked owls were introduced. Sadly, they had little effect on the rat issue. While the economy was suffering, so was the island's ecology. The rats weren't just eating seeds and crops, they were eating everything they could find. Invertebrates, bird eggs, reptiles. Nothing living on the island was safe. The plants began to suffer, and the forests changed, pushing species even further towards their ends. The thousands of seabirds that nested on the island all moved to smaller offshore islets and rocks. And sadly, the Tasmanian masked owls only made the problem worse, preferring to eat native birds over the rats. Despite the fact that over 70% of the island was never disturbed by humans, between 1918 and the present day, dozens of species were wiped out. The cucumber star was found on Lord Howe Island until recently, while the bridal flower disappeared around the 1950s. The only endemic species of bat on the island, the Lord Howe long-eared bat, also disappeared before it could even be recorded. The only reason it is known to have existed today is because of a single skull that was found in 1972. After the initial 2 endemic bird species went extinct, 7 more died out as a result of the rats and the owls. This includes the only endemic owl found on the island. The endemic birds that went extinct are the robust white-eye, the Lord Howe garrigon, the Lord Howe fantail, the Lord Howe starling, the Lord Howe thrush, the Lord Howe parakeet, and the Lord Howe boobook. Both of the endemic species of lizard, the Lord Howe Island skink and the Lord Howe Island gecko, are now very rare on the mainland, but thankfully still thriving on offshore islets and rocks. Finally, the endemic invertebrates that went extinct include several species of snail, the Lord Howe Island cockroach, and the Lord Howe Island stick insect. Or at least we thought. Invertebrates are complicated to keep track of. For one, they're often the last species to be recorded in an ecosystem by scientists. They're also often the most abundant group of animals in any given ecosystem, and finding them is difficult because of their size. Sadly, this means that there are probably several species of invertebrate that went extinct on the island that we will never know about. But it also means we have a little more hope for some of their rediscovery. It was the rediscovery of one of these invertebrates that put Lord Howe Island into the public eye today. Located 24 kilometers off the south coast of Lord Howe Island is an islet known as Ball's Pyramid. It's the tallest volcanic stack in the world, measuring 572 meters in height. In the 1850s, people first stepped foot on the islet to survey it, but without the proper equipment at the time, the stack was never climbed. 100 years later, in the 1960s, rock climbing was starting to become very popular around the world. And in 1964, a group of scouts from Sydney decided to attempt to climb to the summit. They spent 5 days climbing before being forced to call it off due to lack of food and water. But on that climb, someone noticed something interesting. They came across a small crevice that had fresh water seeping through the rocks below. This allowed it to support a small community of plants. One of the plants was a tea tree shrub, and there, beside the shrub, was the skin of an insect they hadn't seen before. They snapped a picture of it and shared the story with some of the residents back on Lord Howe Island. The same thing happened again in 1969. Island residents began to believe that these skins might be from an insect that was thought to have gone extinct over 40 years prior in 1920, only 2 years after the rat invasion. But because only the molts of the insect had been found, it was impossible to say if the insect was still alive or if these shed exoskeletons were from before the insect died out. And so the legend of their existence was relegated to stories told among locals, with no further evidence that the Lord Howe Island stick insect was still alive. The Lord Howe Island stick insect, sometimes called the tree lobster, was a massive species of phasmid that was once common on the island. It was so common, in fact, that fishermen would use them as bait on their lines. But after the rats were introduced in 1918, the stick insect declined rapidly, and within 2 years, they were gone. These stick insects were impressive. Not only were they huge, measuring up to 20 centimeters in length, they had several features that made them unique. For one, they were totally wingless in both males and females. Normally, at least male phasmids are winged so they can fly and find a mate. But due to their small range, wings were no longer needed. The males also had enlarged hind legs, used for defense. This is similar to other island species in the region, like Eurycantha calcarata, which are found on New Guinea, New Caledonia, and the Solomon Islands. Also, the species at times formed paired bonds, an extremely uncommon phenomenon among insects. But they also shared a lot of characteristics with other phasmids. They were strictly vegetarian, thought to prefer tea tree shrubs. They could regrow lost limbs. They were nocturnal. And they had the ability to reproduce asexually through a process called parthenogenesis, which allows the females to produce fertile eggs that are complete replicas of herself. Females looked like they had a stinger at the end of their abdomen, but this was actually an ovipositor used to embed eggs into the soil for protection. All insects have exoskeletons. This hard shell acts as protection and maintains the insect's shape, but it also makes it harder for insects to grow. Stick insects need to molt by shedding their exoskeletons multiple times through their lives, and each time they do, they have a small window of time to grow larger before their new exoskeleton hardens. Often, they eat their old molt in order to reabsorb the lost nutrients, but other times, it just floats away like a dead leaf. So, how long had the molts found on Ball's Pyramid been there? While it was possible that they had been from insects that lived on the islet over 40 years ago, it seemed more likely that somehow the species was still living on the steep rock jutting out of the ocean. While multiple expeditions had taken place to search for the species, it wasn't until 2001 that a miracle happened. Two scientists from Australia, David Priddle and Nicholas Carlisle, believed that the island could still support the Lord Howe Island stick insect. So they planned an expedition to Ball's Pyramid with 2 assistants. They landed on the northwest end of the island and managed to scale up the grassy slope about 120 meters. As they went, they searched for any signs of the species, but could only find crickets. On the way back down, they stumbled on a tea tree shrub that was about 70 meters up the slope, and under it, they noticed large droppings, possibly from a large insect. But the Lord Howe Island stick insect was nowhere in sight. Thankfully, the scientists were familiar with the behavior of phasmids and assumed that if the insects were still alive, they would be hiding during the day and only active at night. So Nicholas Carlisle returned after dark with local ranger Dean Hiscox, and the pair climbed back up to the bush. And there, they found not 1, but 3 Lord Howe Island stick insects happily eating on the plant, oblivious to the fact that they were the very last of their kind. Through later surveys, it was found that a population of between 20 and 40 individuals was being sustained in and around the tea tree plant, leaving their ongoing survival in a precarious situation. How the species got from Lord Howe Island to this tiny islet is still a mystery, but there are 2 main theories. The first is that seabirds, which used to nest on Lord Howe Island, possibly carried several insects through the years over to the islet. But the more likely theory is that fishermen carried the insects as bait, and perhaps while fishing off the coast of Ball's Pyramid, they happened to release a few on the islet. Little did they know, this would be the species' saving grace. The discovery was announced, and international media attention raised awareness of the species' plight. 2 years later, in 2003, a research team returned to Ball's Pyramid and collected 4 insects, 2 males and 2 females. One pair was sent to a private breeder in Sydney. The other, nicknamed Adam and Eve, was sent to the Melbourne Zoo. Initially, it proved quite difficult to breed the insects in captivity. The pair sent to the private breeder ultimately ended up being a failure. But the pair at the Melbourne Zoo eventually managed to produce a few viable eggs. By 2006, the zoo population was up to 50 insects, meaning that there were officially more captive Lord Howe Island stick insects than wild ones. By 2017, only 16 stick insects could be found on Ball's Pyramid. Thankfully, the captive breeding programs were becoming very successful, and new programs were started in Bristol, San Diego, and even directly on Lord Howe Island. Today, the captive breeding population stands at between 4,000 and 5,000 animals, and the programs continue to find success with the reproduction of the species. So now that the insect is being brought back from the brink of extinction, what's next? The people of Lord Howe Island today are highly conscious of the unique beauty and diversity of the island that they call home. The vast majority of Lord Howe Island is protected, and locals are doing far more than just setting aside pristine forests to ensure the island's future. An extensive plan to protect the island began in 1974. By 1981, 70% of the island was declared a permanent park preserve. The following year, it was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This was crucial as it meant that the island would receive funding from the United Nations in order to preserve the island and its native species. In 1995, the first steps were taken to eradicate invasive species. While rats were already regularly being hunted and killed, the eradication program began with several plant species that were destroying the native forests. Ground asparagus, bridal creeper, cherry guava, Madeira vine, cotton easter, ochna, and cestrum were all removed from Lord Howe Island, while a few other invasive plants have proven impossible to eradicate, such as croftonweed and Formosa lily. Then, in the early 2000s, the first programs to eradicate feral animal populations began. Cats, pigs, and goats were all successfully removed from the ecosystem, giving birds a far greater chance of survival. The last species that needed to be tackled were the worst offenders, the rats. In 2012, the Australian government announced that it would provide $9 million Australian dollars to help with an extensive rat poisoning program. This involved trapping all of the island's woodhen and currawong populations, then spreading rat poison all over the island, and finally, once the threat of the poison was gone, reintroducing all of the captured birds. This took place in 2019 and was a huge success. However, not all of the rats were gone yet. The island set up a rat detection program using dogs, and the most recent rat to be seen was in August of 2022. And it seems that Lord Howe Island is on the cusp of successfully being declared rat-free. Now that the rats are possibly gone, the Lord Howe Island stick insect is set to be reintroduced to the island within the next 5 years. It's currently still considered critically endangered, but that likely won't be for much longer. Lord Howe Island today is not what it was before human contact. Many species have been lost. But what's amazing is that it has also been through human intervention that many species have been saved. 2 snail species of the genus Pseudocoropa have made remarkable recoveries since the rat eradication. In surveys only a few years ago, scientists were lucky to see even one. But on a survey performed in 2021, dozens were found. Amazingly, A new species of the same genus has also been described. Given the name Ball's pinwheel snail, the scientists that found it had never seen it before, quickly identifying it as a new species. They went and checked old museum collections from the island and found that it had been collected many times before 1915, when it was seemingly quite common, but it had never been officially described. In 2021, it was finally identified as a new species, and it had gone unseen for over 100 years. Another species of invertebrate, the Lord Howe Island wood-feeding cockroach, was also wiped off the island by the rats. For 60 years, no one saw one, until they were rediscovered on 2 small offshore islands. But amazingly, a biology student from the University of Sydney named Maxim Adams was surveying wildlife on Lord Howe Island in 2022 when he flipped over a rock under a banyan tree. And there, sitting in the dirt, was a Lord Howe Island wood-feeding cockroach. Maxim was actually working under Nicholas Carlisle, one of the scientists that rediscovered the Lord Howe Island stick insect. And the pair found whole families of the cockroaches living under that one banyan tree, but nowhere else that they surveyed on the island. Scientists are considering the possibility of a breeding program for the roaches as well, though it seems that the population is naturally recovering due to the rat eradication program. The forest is also changing back to what it once was. With much of the undergrowth having been destroyed by feral animals in the past, scientists have noted that the forest is looking fuller and healthier than they have ever seen it. And all of this is good news for Lord Howe Island. Not only for the ecosystem, but for the very people that call it home today. With a population of less than 400, the island welcomes up to 400 tourists at a time. People are drawn to the island because of its natural beauty. There's a 9-hole golf course, beautiful beaches, and world-class water activities to enjoy in the ocean surrounding the island. This generates 30 million Australian dollars in annual revenue, allowing inhabitants to make a living while protecting the amazing diversity of this truly unique paradise. And that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed learning about Lord Howe Island. And before you go, don't forget to help me out with the algorithm by leaving a comment and liking the video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.